Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to another episode of our college football rankings. Last week, like we said, there was a lot of big games going on, so we will see a lot of movement on this list. And with that being said, we're going to start off with our 25 spots. Both of us have some new teams towards the bottom of these lists just because there was a lot of teams that fell off, a lot of teams that moved up, moved down. So with that being said, starting off in the 25 spot, this week, I have Kansas State, who is coming back into my rankings. They were back in here before, and they lost a game before, so they moved out. But now they're back in, especially with some spots up for grabs. There's a lot of teams within this area. I know there's some that you have that I don't have. And a lot of these teams, especially towards the bottom of the list, if they were really that good, then I think they would be higher up for both of us. But that's why a lot of these bottom tier teams towards the end of the list are definitely up for interpretation.
Yeah, and towards the bottom of my list, my biggest priority was paying respect to teams I felt like really deserved it. These might not be teams that hang around for a long time, but at 25, I have Louisville. They just beat Boston College in blowout fashion after Florida State. We just saw the week before have a really tough time with them. So I thought that was super impressive. Their quarterback, Jake Plummer, hasn't been awesome, or Jack Plummer, excuse me, hasn't been awesome all year or anything, but he just threw 5 touchdowns with no interceptions, almost hit 400 yards. That Louisville offense looks really good, and they play Notre Dame on October 7th. I think that's going to be a really fun game. I don't really expect them to go out and win that game or anything, but it's definitely a game that I feel like deserves to be a ranked matchup. The Cardinals deserve to be around that spot.
And in my 24 spot, I have Kansas. So far, they're 4-0, and I thought they deserved to be on this list. They were on the list before for the AP, I believe, in their 24 spot. Now I have them in the 24 spot. And they're a team that we've seen throughout the past few weeks, like we saw with Iowa last week, who I had ranked. They're playing Texas this week. So this might be their only week that they're ranked for this season. But even if they lose that game and they come back, I still think they're a solid team. So they're on it for now.
Yeah. At number 24, I have Fresno State. They had a tough game against Eastern Washington a couple years ago, but they won, or a couple weeks ago, excuse me. But they won it. They just beat Arizona State. They beat Kent State back-to-back weeks. Those teams are both all right. And their schedule fares really well for them. I think this Fresno State team could be in a spot where they almost go undefeated or pretty close to that this season. And I don't necessarily know if they get a playoff spot off that. That's a tough call. But I don't really anticipate them to lose a whole lot of games. So they have some question marks, obviously, especially on that defensive side of the ball. I don't think they have a run defense. But Fresno State Bulldogs, I think they're pretty solid so far. So 24.
In my 23 spot, I have Mizzou. They're coming into this week going 4-0. They take Vanderbilt on this week and then LSU next week, and that's going to be a big game for them. Mizzou is always one of those teams, especially in the SEC. If they're at home, they're always a tough matchup. So in 2 weeks, we'll be looking out for that LSU game. That's always an upset alert game. Whenever Missouri's playing and they're hot, especially at home, they are always on upset watch. But for now, they're in the 23 spot, and I wouldn't be surprised if they can move up.
Yeah. And at 23, I have Oregon State. Obviously, we'll talk about Washington State a little later. They had a tough game against the Cougars. They came out and killed them. DJ was not horrible by any means, but they lost the passing yard battle by over 200 yards. That's really the story of the game. They just could not contain Cam Ward. He looked really, really good. But I think the Beavs still have a lot of things going for them. My guy, Damian Martinez, he had a touchdown early, but for the most part, Washington State handled the run game a little better than most teams have against Oregon State. So I think they still have a lot of really good things going there. They're definitely a ranked team to me, but that was not a good loss against Washington State, who, again, we both have higher up.
Yep. And next up, 22, I have Tennessee back on my rankings. Last week, they're right on the outside, but this week, with teams falling off, I think they deserve to be back up here. Going into this week, they are going against South Carolina, who we saw give Georgia a little bit of trouble in the first half. This is a revenge game for them after last year. So going into this game, this could be a big win for them. South Carolina may not be the best team on paper overall, but it's always tough in these SEC matchups like we saw with Georgia. So a very impressive win, even though South Carolina isn't ranked, if they can get it done this week.
For sure. And at 22, I have Kansas State. They're 3-1 right now, and their run game has really opened up. That's definitely what I was looking out for this year. DJ Giddens looks really, really solid, and obviously had big or small shoes to fill with Deuce Vaughn leaving. But Kansas State has 3 big games coming up around the corner. They have Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, and TCU. I don't have any of those teams ranked, but they're probably all in my top 35-ish. So they're all all good Big 12 matchups. So I think if Kansas State gets on a roll, they build momentum there. They can climb back towards that, 15 and up spot that I was giving them in weeks past. But they took a trip off the list for me. They're back now. I think Kansas State is a really good team.
Yeah, next up in my 21 spot, I have Florida, who moved up a few spots this week. Going into this week, though, they are playing in Kentucky. So another game that I would have on upset watch. This Kentucky team has been solid this year. They're 4-0, and they've been looking good. The roster itself, I don't know if they're the best overall, but their quarterback position, Devin Leary, he has been good this year so far, and Florida is going to be in for a tough matchup this week. This is one of those games where if Florida loses, Kentucky can definitely jump on the rankings at 5-0 up to that point. But this Florida team is still solid. It's still the team that we saw beat Tennessee, but definitely in for a big matchup this week.
For sure. And talking about Tennessee, I have them at 21. Obviously, they handled business against UTSA. And I think the biggest issue in that Florida game, looking back on it, is the playbook not being fully open. It was a lot of the same screen passes and runs up the middle. And against UTSA, a worse team, I think they felt more comfortable doing a lot of different things. Joe Milton kind of did his best Hendon Hooker impression, got a big 80-yard touchdown rush, really impressive for the first play of the game. And getting Dylan Sampson more touches was really big to Tennessee's game plan. Obviously, they have a running back room that has guys like Jalen Wright, Jabari Small, but Sampson was supposed to be the number one guy going into last season. He's kind of taking a little bit of a hit, but it seems like if he's going to be playing, he's going to be really good. And him getting 2 touchdowns, I think it's good for morale and obviously good for the Volunteers. So I was impressed, beat a team they should have beat, but I'll talk about Florida later. I don't think they jumped them quite yet.
And starting off the top 20, I have Oregon State here at 20. They lost last week. They had dropped down 4 spots for me. And this week, going up against Utah again, this is one of those stretches where back-to-back games against high-ranked opponents last week, losing to Washington State, this week going against Utah. And they're a decent squad overall, but if they lose this game, they're out of the rankings, I think, after 2 back-to-back losses. Even though they're against ranked opponents, this Oregon State team is still solid. I think the Utah team is better. We still have no idea what's going on with the quarterback situation in Utah. I mean, you can look a bunch of different places and get a bunch of different timetables, but we really don't know what's going to happen. And Oregon State going into this game has to win this game to keep their season alive. I still think they're definitely in it for a potential championship game for them. They can boost up and maybe get a New Year's Six bowl. This team is still solid, but they have to go out and win this game.
Yeah. And at number 20, I have Florida, who I just talked about a little bit. I wasn't super impressed with their game against Charlotte. I think a lot of things went wrong, especially their running game. Charlotte's run defense is good, but at the end of the day, this is a non-Power 5 school. Florida should go out and be a little more impressive. Graham Mertz looked solid. He's a really good game manager, not an insult. We talk about this every week. And Ricky Pearsall is a really good receiver, so don't get me wrong. But part of me wanted to have Tennessee jump Florida because Florida looked pretty shaky. Still, the head-to-head matchup is going to be big for me there. But I mean, on 3rd and 4th downs, they only went 1-10 on the day against a team like Charlotte. Wasn't super impressive to me. With that being said, they have the resume to be a top 20 team. They have played like a top 20 team in the past, so I'm going to keep them at 20.
And next up, I have Ole Miss here in the 19 spot. They dropped down a few spots for me after losing that game against Alabama. They were in it for a while, leading at halftime 7-6, but then in the second half, they just couldn't get the offense started. Quinshon Judkins, who going into this season was one of my key players, especially for this team. I thought one of the best running backs in the country. He was unstoppable before. Just hasn't been able to get it done. I mean, only 56 yards on the ground this game, and they just haven't been able to do much for that. This Alabama defense went out there and they carried the team. Jalen Milroe did what he needed to do, and obviously on the ground, getting a lot of solid yards. And this Ole Miss team, I still think, is in contention for a good season. Maybe not all the way now, like they could have been if they beat this Alabama team. They definitely could have gone to the SEC championship. But for now, I think they're kind of out of it. I think they're maybe 1 or 2 years away. I think if Jackson Dart can continue to develop, this season definitely isn't lost. They can still get a good bowl game. But I think if you can recruit well next year, this team is still on the up. You just need to bounce back from this game.
Yeah, and at 19, I have a team we mentioned earlier, which is Washington State. I have them a little lower than some people do, but that's really not a dig at Washington State. I think they're a really, really fun and a really good team. That last minute 4th quarter comeback from Oregon State scared me a little bit, but I just think it's an impressive win no matter what. You beat a higher ranked team at home, and Cam Ward is really a guy that needs to be started talking about for the Heisman race. I won't spoil our rankings, but you might not see him there, but he's getting pretty close. He has had really great games every game. And he's draft eligible. He's really, it seems like he's trying to make a case for him to be a day one guy. He really is that good. Don't get me wrong. He might not be there yet. And they have a big game coming up against UCLA, who's a team that we both had ranked in the past, maybe not last week, but throughout this season. So that's going to shake rankings up no matter which way it goes. I think this Washington State team is really electric. And if Cam Ward plays like this, they go from Cinderella story to make a playoff push to actual contender really quick.
Yeah. And next up, in our 18 spot, I have Miami. And this team has been solid throughout this year. They're going to be having a bye week next week, so they're going to have the week off. But overall, on the ground, Henry Parrish, 140 yards and 2 touchdowns, big for them. Tyler Van Dyke, 220 yards and 3 touchdowns. That combination between those two guys and this receiver room has looked good. And I think they'll continue to be able to make a push. Like we've said, there's so many ACC teams that are good this year, and they're all going to have to go against each other. So we'll see who the best is coming out of the pack. I do think they might be a step behind Duke and UNC, as I have them both ranked above them, but I have this at 16, 17, and 18 between UNC, Duke, and Miami. So they may be a step behind, but they're still running in the same lane right now. And it is going to be a close race. When all these teams go against each other, it'll be fun to watch because I think all these teams have holes. I think UNC has the best quarterback between these three, but we've seen amazing things from all three of these quarterbacks and all three of these teams. So it'll be fun to watch these guys go against each other.
For sure. And at 18, you already talked about Ole Miss a little bit, but their offense just really couldn't get it going against a really good Alabama defense. And I think we saw with the Texas game that throwing the ball deep is going to be how you beat this Alabama defense. And it just wasn't working. They weren't firing on all cylinders. And as you mentioned, I think Quinshon Judkins is one of the best backs in the league, and we haven't really seen it so far. I think in this game specifically, it was because Alabama's run defense is really that good, but still you would have liked to see more flashes. LSU is going to be a really tough matchup coming up from Ole Miss. I think that game alone is going to shake up a ton of things in these rankings. So that's obviously a game to look out for on the horizon. I still think Ole Miss is legit. They have a ton of talent on the team. They just came out flat against Alabama, and that game for them was going to be a real chance to bury Alabama for good this season, and they just aren't the team that did it. And, that's all right. Still top 25, and I think the Rebels have a lot of good things going forward.
And next up, I have Duke on here, like I talked about a little bit before. This team still very solid too, but going into this week, a huge matchup against Notre Dame. We just saw Notre Dame lose to Ohio State. So this team definitely, obviously coming out into that game, it was at the end of the game that Notre Dame lost. But this Duke team at home, I think this is going to be a very good game. Riley Leonard, if he can go in there and do exactly what he needs to do, then he can come out here and Duke can make this a close game. I still think Notre Dame is a step better, but since it's in Duke, I have to give them the benefit of the doubt. I think it'll be a close game, and it is going to fall on Riley Leonard. This is one of those games where we've seen the hype build up for him being one of these potential, first day quarterbacks going into the season before. I kind of had him as a day 3 guy where he could kind of fit into a team and be a good backup. But if he can go out here and keep continuing to play well, this is going to be the biggest game of the year for them as of right now, going against Notre Dame. Everyone's going to be watching this game. So if Riley Leonard can keep it going and win this game, that'll be massive for Duke and him. And I think this will set them above UNC and probably be the best team in the ACC up to this point besides Florida State.
Fair enough. And this is where I start my run of talking about the ACC teams. I have Miami at 17. Just another game where Tyler Van Dyke looked legit as Miami continues to blow out all the teams they should. You mentioned Henry Parrish. He also looked great. And Corey Couch got 2 picks off of the Temple QB. This team is just hot right now. And you have to believe in this offense because they haven't put up less than 38 points all season. Miami is really good. As you mentioned, I also have a couple ACC teams ranked ahead of them, but I wouldn't be surprised if Miami's, the legit one of the pack. They have the offense for it. So I think the Hurricanes are on a roll as of now.
And next up, my final of the 3 ACC teams that we've been talking about. UNC, I still think, is above the other two. Drake May was a little Not the best, not the Drake May that we saw from last season, but going into this game, 300 yards and a touchdown, and he made some big plays against that Pitt team. And he made his way back in, maybe not in the top 5 of the Heisman race right now, but he did look very good in this game. I mean, throwing a left-handed touchdown on the run, that's just something that we don't see. And he went out here and he's proving that he's going to be a legit quarterback threat in this draft class. And I think once we start to see these games, especially against teams like Duke and Miami, then he'll have his time to show out again. But for now, he's continuing to build his hype back up. And this UNC team is still very solid. And we'll see what happens as they go forward. I still think they're very solid, and I think they're the best of these 3 teams. But like we said before, if Duke can come out and win this game against Notre Dame, I think that gives them the step.
Yeah, I mean, at 16, I have North Carolina. Obviously, the difference here is that I have them below Duke. Drake May, he's looking like a dual threat. Obviously, that touchdown in the air that you mentioned, 2 on the ground. But, this Pitt game didn't show too much for me. Phil Jurkovich got knocked out early, and the backup Pitt QB gave Elijah Hustle 2 easy interceptions. What I will say about this game that I think is someone to look out for, we all know about Marianne Hampton, but J.J. Jones is continuing to emerge as a big weapon for May. And if that's going to be something that continues, I like the path they're going down. I will say about this matchup they have against Syracuse, Syracuse is undefeated, and that's a game that they could get caught up in. Syracuse, obviously, last year had a lot of buzz. They were nationally ranked for a couple weeks. It's just a well-coached team, and they play a style of football that relies heavy on the run. They do a lot of things well on defense. That's the kind of game I'm scared of a team like UNC falling into the trap for. I don't want them to look ahead in their schedule and pass up on the orange because I think Syracuse could be a tough game. That being said, we know North Carolina's strengths. We know Drake May, even though he started off a little slower than we thought, is one of the best QBs in the country. They're going to have a lot of things going for them. As I'll mention when I talk about Duke, I don't necessarily think they have the step up on all of the other teams in the ACC right now.
Yeah, and next up, 15, I have Washington State, so a little bit higher on them than I know you are in the rankings right now. But like you said before, Cam Ward is playing out of his mind up to this point. 400 yards and 4 touchdowns, and this Washington State team is looking as solid as we've seen in a long time. They're going to have a bye week this week, but then coming back after that, they still have teams like UCLA, who's going to be tough. They fell out of the rankings this week, but still a tough matchup, especially in UCLA. But the rest of the schedule besides that, they are going to play teams like Cal, like Stanford, like Arizona State. So they should be on a roll. And this team at 15 right now, they're going to see Washington at the end of the season. So that's going to be a massive matchup. They are going to see Oregon in October. But besides those 2 games, they should be able to run through the rest of the schedule. And they definitely have a very good chance in the Pac-12. Obviously, not playing USC this year, that helps them a lot. So this Washington State team with one of the best quarterbacks in the nation should continue to roll.
For sure. And at 15, I have Duke, 1 spot higher than UNC. Riley Leonard, obviously, he's the main story right now. He's just continues to cook every week. He led the team in rushing and passing. And I know it's just against UConn, but he just looks better and better every week. He looks more confident. He looks honed in on what he's doing. And I just want to give a shout out to the Blue Devils defense. I feel like with Riley Leonard being so good, they've kind of flown under the radar, but they're a really solid defense. They got a lot of guys involved. I want to talk about Aeneas Pebbles a little bit. He ended the game with 2 sacks. Again, UConn offensive line, not incredible, but anytime you can walk out a game with 2 sacks, one of them being a really big hit on the QB, you should be happy about that. I think Duke is just looking slightly more impressive than a lot of their ACC counterparts. And I think that Notre Dame game is going to be really, really good. It's not a prediction, but if Duke wins that game, I don't think people should be as surprised as they might be. This Duke team is really, really solid. And that might be my game of the week. I'm really looking forward to that one.
And next up in the 14th spot, I have Oklahoma here. They did struggle a little bit against Cincinnati, but Dillon Gabriel did find a way to win this game for them. 300 plus yards. He only did have 1 touchdown, so they struggled to get it in the end zone, but he still made it work. This team is still very solid. And for a team that we've seen, it seems like they're putting up 60 points a week. That's why this 20 points seems like a struggle to them, but still a very solid team overall. And my biggest question going into the season, would Dillon Gabriel be able to get it done for them? And so far he has. He hasn't given me a reason why I don't think this team can compete. I think they're going to continue to keep rolling. And they're at 14 right now. They have an easy game against Iowa State, but the week after that, next week, they have Texas. So if they can get it figured out this week, they need to get everything together and their offense clicking again when they go back into Texas, especially playing in Texas, because that's going to be a huge game. And I mean, playoff implications for both of those teams. If Oklahoma can go against Texas next week, which we'll talk about more next week, and they win that game somehow, then that's going to be massive for them. But going into this week, I want to see that offense figure it out, especially against Iowa State, and they should be able to get it back together.
Yeah, for sure. At 14, I have Oklahoma as well. So, I mean, you checked all the boxes for the most part. Dylan Gabriel looks good, and he has to look good if this team's going to succeed. Their defense makes me really, really nervous. I'm not going to lie. I know it was only 6 points, but they're the definition of bend, don't break. Obviously, Emory Jones, former Florida quarterback, is now the guy at Cincinnati. And if he knew how to take care of the football, this score would have been a lot closer. And that's definitely something I was looking out for. With that being said, Oklahoma, this game wasn't my favorite from them, but outside of that, they've looked really good. Gabriel was my big question mark as well. He looks good. So I can't be too nervous. I think that Iowa State game should roll right off. I think that's a win for them. And then that Texas game, as you mentioned, is shaping up to be really good. Texas is a team that a lot of people have ranked in the top 4, top 5. Oklahoma, assuming they beat Iowa State and there's a little shakeup in front of them, they could be sniffing the top 10. It's going to be a really big game for them. So I agree with what you're saying. I think 14 is the right spot.
Yeah, and next up, I have Alabama here at 13. So no movement from a team that just beat Ole Miss, and usually there will be some question marks around that, but still, this Alabama team has still looked shaky, and I still have them behind Notre Dame, even though Notre Dame lost that game. They lost it at the very end on the last play of the game, and this Alabama team, their defense helped them out a lot against Ole Miss. They were losing at halftime, but then they came back in the second half. That run game, the combination of McLean and Milroe, they got it done. They won the game against Ole Miss, but there's still some question marks surrounding this team overall, like we've seen, especially in that quarterback spot. They won't have some big games until that 2-game stretch against Tennessee and LSU, and then they have Kentucky after that too. This team is still up in the air for me. I'm not really sure how I feel about it. The defense is one of the best in the country. I would say top 5 at least. I would say even top 3 up to this point. And they've been able to carry this team. The offense has done what they needed to do to win the games. And they're still a solid team overall. There's still so many question marks surrounding them.
Yeah, I'm in the same spot as you here. I also have Alabama 13. As everyone mentioned, as you mentioned as well, Alabama's defense looked really solid. Ole Miss has a good offense, a dynamic offense, and they didn't look that way in this game. So I was impressed with that. I think the biggest question that everyone's saying is the QB problem, because I don't think Alabama's offensive line is bad. I think they have a problem with getting a quarterback who, can control the offense and is decisive. At this point, I don't care who it is. I'm a Jalen Milroe guy. I hope that they let him figure it out. But at the end of the day, if he won't do it, you have to commit to someone else. It gets to a point where you can't just put in Buckner. You can't put in Simpson. You can't put in Milroe. You have to make a decision. And if they're committed to Milroe, I think they need to run the offense better to his game. We know he's a guy that can move. We know he's a guy that runs really well. So let's see more designed runs. Let's see him and McClellan do dynamic stuff. But I feel like they run this offense very basic, especially for an Alabama offense, because they don't know which quarterback they're going to have playing in it at all times. So, they beat a ranked team and they don't move. So that definitely can reflect poorly on, either of our lists if you feel differently about it. But I don't think they impressed me enough to move up. But, they won the game against a ranked team. I'm not going to move them down here.
Yeah. And next up, Notre Dame, only moving down 3 spots here. I think I only had them moving down a little bit because I didn't have them as high as some people did before this game. And I had them losing to my second best team in the country up to this point in Ohio State. I know the AP still only has them at 4, but especially after this win, I don't see how they're not better than Michigan, but I'll talk about that later. This Notre Dame team looks solid. They had the win in the bag, obviously, until that last play. Sam Hartman looked all right. He didn't look like the same quarterback that we've seen throughout this season. I was expecting a little bit more from him, but they're going against one of the best defenses in the country from top to bottom. We didn't even see that much from Marvin Harrison this game. He got locked up only 3 receptions for 32 yards, but it's one of those games where if you look at it again, he got locked up, but Emeka Egbuka, who's been questionable throughout this season, he's had some good games, he's had some bad games, came out here and proved that he is a first-round talent again, close to 100 yards, and Kyle McCord got it done in the air. He didn't get any touchdowns throwing, but this rushing team, it was a slug it out game. Obviously, 17-14, not a lot of touchdowns in this game. Trayvon Henderson was the difference, though. This Notre Dame team still has a good chance to make a push. Coming up, they're going to go against Duke this week, so another big game. If they can't beat Duke, though, then I don't know how I feel about them for the rest of the season. If they can come out, that's a big win for them. They play USC in a few weeks, too, so there's still some optimism behind this team. You can still definitely get into the playoffs if you can come out and win those 2 games. Those are going to be massive games, especially if your only loss is to Ohio State by 3, but you need to go out here and win this game against Duke.
Yeah, for sure. As well, I have Notre Dame as well for mostly all the same reasons. It was definitely a slugfest in South Bend this weekend. Hartman looked solid. You know, he seems to always look solid, but it kind of reminded me of older Notre Dame teams, you know, when with guys like Mayer and, you know, guys like Book at quarterback, where it was really just a QB tight end connection that worked. Mitchell Evans is a really good tight end, don't get me wrong, but Hartman's best games are when he spreads the game out, you know, hits all of his receivers, checks all his boxes, all that. The running back Estime is one of the best backs in the country, and he just couldn't get much going in this game. I think a lot of that is a credit to Ohio State's defense. I'm sure some people would have liked to see Notre Dame drop more, but I still think they looked good. I think they just played a really, really tough game, and their defense held up really well until that last drive. And I think that's important. This Ohio State team can score in bunches. You know, they have the best receiver in the country. People would argue the best duo, and their defense held that under check until the very last drive. So I think Notre Dame is probably, you know, if they win that Duke game, I expect really good things from them still this season. It's just a tough loss. 12 is not a spot they want to be in, but especially compared to other teams and seeing how far we've dropped them after losses, it's pretty generous. I think Notre Dame is still fine, and I expect them to figure it out pretty soon.
Yeah, next up, I have Utah in this spot at the 11 spot going against UCLA. This was one of those games that was going to be very close, especially with the Utah quarterback situation. They got a pick 6 on the first play of the game and then only got 1 touchdown the rest of the game. They win the game 14-7, so not the best game overall. There was very good defense on both sides. I mean, we saw guys with multiple sacks on both sides. And overall, this Utah team, they won the game, so I'm not going to move them down, but a lot of question marks after this game. UCLA was a tough game, but being able to only get 1 offensive touchdown is not a great look. And they're going into this stretch where they're going to play Oregon within the next 6 weeks. So obviously, very big test for them. Oregon State's going to be another big test for them, another ranked opponent this week. So if they can get that done, then they're going to change my mind. But right now, they're definitely on the edge of a team that I'm not really sure how I feel about them, kind of around that same area as Alabama, but this Utah team hasn't lost a game yet, so I still have them ranked up here. But with this tough schedule going on, I wouldn't be surprised if Utah potentially even falls out of the rankings in the next few weeks, because I just feel way more confident about those teams like Oregon and Washington than a team like Utah right now.
Fair enough. At 11, I have LSU. I like Arkansas. I had them ranked a couple weeks ago, but the win over the Razorbacks wasn't super convincing for me. It's not enough for me to move LSU for sure. Jayden Daniels fighting back for his Heisman spot. He looks really, really good still. And Arkansas just kind of kept it close the whole game. And it's not something I expected. I expected LSU to really go out and, you know, in an SEC matchup against a team that they should be much superior than. It was too close for my liking, honestly. I don't think it reflects too poorly on LSU. Obviously, conference play is tough, but I expected more. I will say, though, Greg Penn on their defense, I think earlier this year, I talked a lot about Harold Perkins, you know, because a lot of people he was incredible as a freshman. And, you know, he's still been playing good football, but I think Greg Penn has really impressed me on this LSU defense. He was all over the place. He got a couple big stops on 3rd down, you know, 2nd and long, all those places you need big stops. So LSU has a lot of good things going. I wasn't impressed enough to move them up a spot, but I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon.
And like you just said, I have LSU in the 10 spot. This team overall has looked solid. They've come back from that loss before. And the biggest thing for me going into this week, they're going to be in a massive game against Ole Miss. This is going to be a tough game for both teams. This is going to be one of those games where I'm expecting these two high-level offenses to battle it out. They are in Mississippi, so we'll see how that fares for LSU. But obviously, a massive game for the SEC implications for both of these teams. Both of these teams have been solid this year. I have LSU still in my top 10. I was very high going into them, going into this season, but a game against Ole Miss, I've been really high on both of these teams, especially the quarterback play from both of these guys. So I'm expecting a high scoring game from both of these teams. I think the LSU defense better than the Ole Miss defense. The Ole Miss defense, we've seen them be solid, but we've seen some games where they haven't been great overall. So going into this game, I think whoever wins this game is in for a big boost, especially this LSU team who is behind teams like Washington, USC, and Oregon who've been good, but a very big win for LSU if they can get it done this week, or Ole Miss being able to jump back up into the rankings, even into that top 15 again.
Yeah, and you just talked about some great QB play. That's not the case for my team at number 10. I have Utah. Obviously, Cam Rising being out is an issue just in general. But I thought this UCLA win was really impressive. I think we were giving the Utes a little bit of a disservice last week. We talked about UCLA as a team that could possibly upset them. And although the game was a little shaky, especially for Utah's offense, they handled business. And let's talk about their defense, right? The offense we're not seeing much from, but the defense we're seeing everything. They only allowed 9 rushing yards in the game. That's absolutely nuts. I don't care if UCLA is a team that passes the ball. 9 rushing yards is incredible. And they put a lot of pressure on Dante Moore. Obviously, he was, struggling a little bit. He threw an interception, and then he had a little bit of an injury scare, so he wasn't fully 100%. But they banged him up. They got to him early. And shout out Jonah Ellis. I mentioned the guy earlier with 2 sacks. He had 3.5. That's actually nuts. UCLA's offense, I don't really think was that bad, and Utah made them look like bottom feeders. It was pretty impressive to me. Utah, I think, as you mentioned, they have a really tough schedule and they have a lot of question marks. But based on what I've seen so far, that's a top 10 level team for me. Do I think it's going to stick? Who knows? But right now, I think Utah has impressed me quite a bit. And I think that UCLA win is more impressive than a lot of people would say.
Yeah. And next up, too, in this 9 spot, I have Oregon, who jumped up 3 spots this week for me. A massive win for them. And throughout this whole season, as you guys have known, I've been on the edge with Bo Nix. I've been waiting for him to kind of fall off. I've never been a Bo Nix fan, but up to this point, as you guys would have seen by now, as of this posting, he is in our Heisman rankings. So we had to put him in there. And there's not much that I can say about him because I'm still waiting for it to fall off because I know it will at some point. But for now, he has proven me wrong. He's been good so far, and this Oregon team has been one of the best offenses in the country. I mean, them and Oklahoma have been putting up like 50-plus points a week. Going against Stanford this week, another massive game. I'm expecting Bo Nix to go out there and play great again. We haven't really seen them. They're going to go up against, obviously, some tougher teams going up. Washington, that game against Washington, I'm expecting an absolute duel between those two guys. Bo Nix and Michael Penix, that's going to be one of the best matchups, quarterback matchups that we're going to see this season. So a great game that we're in for there. And this Oregon team has been good. I do have them 1 spot behind Washington still, but they're definitely knocking on the door. And this is going to be a big race going into the end of the season between those two guys.
Yeah, for sure. And to talk about, I have Oregon at 9 as well. To talk more about that Colorado game, they really just kicked the shit out of the Buffs, to be honest. They didn't allow themselves to be beat by Shedeur Sanders, which, is a really tough task. He's one of the best QBs in the country. And they gave him no space to create outside of the pocket. Shedeur's best strength is obviously his arm. He's a quarterback, but he is very creative when he has to move, and that's allows his receivers to find space. Oregon just didn't let that happen. This is where we see the top level teams separate themselves from a streaky team like Colorado. Don't get me wrong, Colorado's really good, especially in those skills positions, but they don't have a single offensive lineman that's better than any Oregon D lineman, and vice versa. They don't have a D lineman that's better than the Oregon's O line. So that makes it really tough for a team like the Buffs to go out there and score any points because there's constant pressure on their best players. Shedeur did everything he could. I don't think he necessarily made very many bad plays, but there weren't plays to be made a lot of the time, and that's the truth. I'll be a little nicer to Oregon fans too. Bo Nix isn't my favorite, but I have no problems with him. He's been really, really good this season. Troy Franklin had himself a game receiving 2 touchdowns, a ton of yards, and he just stole the momentum from Colorado. I think this game was more, to me, Oregon showing that they were legit than Colorado showing they sucked. And I think that's a narrative that's been kind of flipped around, especially on social media. I think Colorado's a good team. I just think Oregon's a top 10 team, and they proved it to me. The game wasn't even close. Exactly what I wanted to see from the Ducks. I think that Washington game is going to be one of the best of the year, as you mentioned. And we'll talk about Washington real quick, but I liked Oregon quite a bit.
Yeah, and like you said, talking about Washington here in the 8th spot, I think they have arguably the best quarterback in the country. Going into this season, Michael Penix was my pick for the Heisman. At that point, he was around like the 5 or 10 range between guys. A lot of people liked Quinn Ewers a little more. But going into this season, MP9 was in for a big year. And with that wide receiver core, he's been able to do wonders. This team overall is one of the best in the country. I mean, I have him at 8 right now, and he has been fantastic. Going into this stretch, like we said, we're going to see Oregon in 2 weeks. They go against Arizona, who isn't the best team overall, but it's still a good test for them. Arizona's 3-1 up to this point. They're playing in Arizona. So hopefully another big game for Penix at this point. And when they play against Washington, and then they're going to have that stretch against, we're going to see we need to see something from Michael Penix up to this point. We've seen him play fantastic, but I want to see him do it against a team like Oregon, and it's going to be a big test for him. But for now, still one of the best teams in the country.
Yeah, I have the Huskies at 8 too. If I can be honest with you, I really wanted this team to be higher. We'll talk about all the other teams I have in front of them, but I wouldn't say no to an argument that this is the top 5 team in the country. They are really, really that good, and it relies on Michael Penix. Credit to their offensive line too. It feels like he has all day to throw back there, but when he does get the time to throw, he launches that thing. It's really impressive. Their wide receiver core is really good, obviously with Rome and Polk. They just had 2 touchdowns each last game. And I'm really not worried about their defense letting up those points against Cal. It looked like the game was a shootout on paper. In real time, it was an insane blowout. All 13 of those Cal point, or not all 13, but 13 of those Cal points, I should say, came in garbage time 4th quarter against the backups. My point is the defense is solid enough to me. The offense could probably be the best in the country. And when they go and play against Oregon, there's going to be fireworks in that game. In the meantime, I think the Huskies are good. If anything wrong happens to, some teams in front of them, I think they're an obvious candidate to jump up. And I'm really, really impressed with this team because at the start of the year, they had a lot of hype, but they also had a lot of people saying they were flukes. And I think they've proved the exact opposite of that narrative so far.
Yeah, next up, USC in the 7th spot. And this week, they're going up against Colorado. So it should be an easy game for them if we see the Colorado team that we saw last week. This Colorado team, like we talked about before, going into this last week, they did lose, and I think you put it up pretty well. I think it just proved that Oregon was a real threat. Colorado going into that game, I still think they have one of the worst defenses that we've seen. Their just defense isn't good. Going into this week, though, they are going against USC, and we've seen USC let up some points like we saw last week. I mean, they let up 28 points to ASU, who is probably one of the worst teams in the country up to this point, and they have been for a while. So, I mean, if you're Colorado, I think there is some optimism there when you have one of the best quarterbacks in the country in Shedeur Sanders, and I think they'll be able to get up some points. I do think USC is obviously the better team overall. But I did have them move down this week 1 spot just because I haven't been as impressed with them as I would hope. And those first few weeks that we saw in the season, like I said, I wasn't going to make teams go down if they haven't played up to the expectations. But we're in the middle of the season now. And if we've seen teams potentially not play up to where I would hope they would be in the past few weeks, and we see other teams exceed, I'm going to move them down. And a team like that, which I'll talk about later, moving into the top 5 that has played well. This USC team is going into a game where they have to be careful because this Colorado offense is dynamic, but I do think they'll be able to outsling them. Caleb Williams, this is a big game for him to kind of put that step above Michael Penix. I think right now they're pretty even. I think anywhere you look, odds wise too, they're right next to each other, but this is one of those games where a lot of people are going to be watching because even though Colorado lost, the hype is still there. So it's going to be a big game for him. And if Caleb Williams can go out there and get it done and get a lot of touchdowns, he can kind of get back up there and secure his spot as the number one guy.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a really good point about, we're halfway through the season now, a little less than halfway, but we're getting there. And teams that are not performing up to the level I thought should be moved down, at least somewhat accordingly. And for me, that's how I feel about Florida State, and I have them at 7. This is 2 straight scary games for the Seminoles, and I know they're out of the weeds a little bit, but these are games that kind of should have been easy for them that just didn't look that way. Their next big game isn't for 3 weeks against Duke. I think there's potential to move up as they handle business, but I mean, they're a team that feels like they could get upset. And we almost saw that against BC. And after that last BC game, I think it's fair to say they're not really a good team. So I don't know what's going on. In my opinion, they just need to run the ball more. Getting Keon Coleman the ball as much as possible is a pretty good strategy. Don't get me wrong, because he's one of the best receivers in the country. But at some point, you go against tougher pass defenses like a lot of teams in the ACC do, especially compared to, teams like Boston College, who are not one of those premier teams in the ACC, then you're screwed, I guess is my point. I think Jordan Travis is really good. We saw him out-duel Jaden Daniels week 1. That was incredibly impressive. That LSU game is really what has them up here in the first place for me, because everything else I've seen from Florida State hasn't been that great. I'm talking a lot of smack for a team that's 7th in my rankings. I still think they're really, really good. If they get that run game going, I think that's a playoff team. We just haven't seen it happen yet. So there's still a lot of question marks with this Seminoles team that I really want to see improve. I think they have a lot of the pieces there. I just am more impressed with all the other teams we're going to talk about up till this point.
Yeah, and you summed it up perfectly. I had Florida State at 5 last week, and 2 weeks ago I had them at 4. Then Texas jumped them, and then Penn State jumped them this week for me too. Florida State, like you've said, they've been in these really close games where it seems like they could get upset, but even in the end they win. But it doesn't seem like one of those games where they have their back against the wall, then they come back, because they're playing teams that they should be up by 20 against. This would be different if they're going against teams like Oregon and their backs against the wall and they somehow figure out how to pull it out, like we saw with Ohio State and Notre Dame. These are teams that they're going against like BC. I know it's a rivalry game, but you shouldn't have it be that close, especially if you have one of the best quarterbacks in the country in Jordan Travis, one of the best wide receivers in the country in Keon Coleman. And this team is very solid overall. But like you've said before, if you're not playing up to the expectations that I have, you're going to drop at least a little bit. And especially a team that I'm going to talk about next, like Penn State, who's been playing higher than the expectations that I had, you're going to drop down a little bit. This Florida State team, they don't have a big game for a little while, so we won't see that. But I don't know. I need to see a little bit more if I'm going to put them back into that playoff contention, especially in a division right now that we're seeing in the ACC with teams like UNC, Duke, and Miami, who are all playing very well. If they're going up against a hard stretch at the end of the season against these teams, I wouldn't be surprised if they get upset, like you said. And this Florida State team, obviously, that big win at the beginning of the season helped them. But let's say they didn't have that win up to this point. If they played a bad team in week 1, are they that high? I guess that's just a question to throw out there. Obviously, that win helps them overall against LSU. But if we're just putting that win aside, what else have they done for me yet? Not much.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the team that I have jumping Florida State is Penn State. Don't get me wrong, the Iowa offense isn't a powerhouse by any means. Cade McNamara is not a good college quarterback, but Penn State's defense just absolutely murdered the Hawkeyes, with that being said. They forced Iowa into offensive and even special teams miscues and just bad plays all day, which gave the Nittany Lions field position and made it easy for them to score at will. PSU's offense, really, you can check the stats, they didn't do a whole lot, and they won 31-0. I mean, we've seen Penn State win games in many different fashions this year. And if this was their first matchup against a team that was ranked in the AP, they were ranked by me, they were ranked by you. They were a team that we had expectations for, and 31-0. Look at the result. I think it's only fair that they move up a spot, at least. With that being said, I know you have them bumped up too. Just want to throw it out there. Whiteout game, great atmosphere, very fun. But just outside of the extracurricular stuff like that, the on-field performance was up to the highest standard. So I was very impressed with the Nittany Lions this week.
Yeah, and I have them in the fifth spot here. I had them jump Florida State and USC. And this team overall, going into this game, I was expecting it to be at least a somewhat close game. I was expecting maybe a 21-point win, but 31-0 is just absolutely insane. Like you said before, this Iowa offense isn't the best, but that Iowa defense is really good. So I wasn't expecting Penn State to just be able to do whatever they wanted against them. Cade McNamara just had nothing. I mean, we saw him transfer from Michigan. He kind of got bumped out of there after he got benched, goes to Iowa, and had 42 passing yards on the day. He was just terrible, and he ended up getting benched at the end of the game, like we said. And this Penn State team overall, Drew Allar with 4 touchdowns. The running game didn't really get that involved overall, just because we didn't really need to see that. Obviously, this passing offense was great. And it seems like they haven't even got into that second gear of the offense. I think this offense still has a lot of untapped potential, which is kind of crazy to say if you're putting up 31 points against a very good defense. And this defense overall, one of the best in the country. I've seen people say that they are the best. They have a very strong argument. I mean, we got guys everywhere on this field. If you look at Kalen King, one of the best cornerbacks in the country, a potential first round pick. Chop Robinson got out there and got a lot of big pressures. Abdul Carter, a fantastic sophomore linebacker. Dominic DeLuca had a big game too. Curtis Jacobs. There's guys top to bottom who are just great for this team, and I have them in the top 5 now. They're not going to have a big test until we see that Ohio State game, but they're going to continue to keep rolling. And against Northwestern next week, I'm expecting the offense to start to click a little bit more. And then they played UMass in a few weeks too. So this offense just needs to click a little bit more. We haven't even seen the best from the offense, which is kind of scary talking about a team that I have in the top 5 now.
For sure. And at 5, I have USC. You obviously mentioned them a little earlier, and you're not the only person I've seen move them down. I think it's becoming very trendy for USC to fall down people's boards in recent weeks. But if I can be honest, I don't see why. Caleb Williams is still the best player in the country, and he is playing that way. Marshawn Lloyd is putting up numbers on the ground. And, I'm impressed with the other teams we've talked about. Don't get me wrong. As I mentioned, Florida State didn't play up to my expectations. Penn State has exceeded those. They switched spots. But I don't think USC has played bad or close to it, like, for any stretch of the season. Looking at box scores, you might see games that are closer than maybe you hope they were, but these were games where the other teams weren't even in it. I think USC every single week has played like a top 5 team. They have the talent on the roster of a top 5 team, and they exceed my expectations every week. Whether they cover the spread or not doesn't really matter to me. I think they're one of the best teams in football. They have obviously a tough stretch where they play Notre Dame. They'll play Utah, who I still expect to be up here. And honestly, I expect them to beat both of those teams. I think USC will prove this ranking. And teams down the board have impressed me. It doesn't make me think they're better than USC. I still think this is a top 5 team. And if I could argue top 4.
Yeah. And in my 4 spot, I have Texas still staying here. No movement in the top 4 for me this week, but Quinn Ewers has continued to look good. They're going to go up against Kansas this week, who I have ranked at 24. So another ranked matchup. I expect this game to go pretty similar to how we saw Penn State and Iowa go last week. A top team going against a ranked team that just got moved in, which will look good for them at the end of the season. But I'm expecting this Texas team to go out and win big. Overall, they're still good, and they're going to have some big tests towards the end of the season that we're going to see. But for now, when they go against Oklahoma next week, that's going to be a big game for them. After that, though, a little bit of an easier stretch to end the season. So right now, kind of in that big stretch, they are going to see Kansas State later in the season and TCU. Both of those teams may not be the best, may not be as highly ranked, but still big games for them and tough tasks. But for now, this team is still staying where they are because they've continued to play well. And Quinn Ewers, one of the best quarterbacks in the country, and they're still going to stay in my 4 spot.
Yeah, man, I have no movement in my playoff spots either. Shout out to Texas. The more I look at it, they scheduled their hardest matchups early in the season. So they should have some credit and be able to coast towards the end if all goes right. As you mentioned, and as you know, is easy to tell when you watch, their offense is especially great this season. Obviously, Mitchell and Worthy, Ewers is one of the best quarterbacks in the country. And the Longhorns it relies on them. It doesn't, the Big 12 honestly doesn't matter too much in their stretch of the season. Obviously, they have to beat those teams, but outside of the games they're playing, it doesn't matter. If they continue just to win out, play well, and stay convincing, they're going to get a playoff spot, in my list and in the AP list. That actually matters. I just think they're doing all the right things. Baylor is not a horrible team. They've been a little underwhelming, don't get me wrong, but Texas steamrolled them. The Longhorns are good, and I've definitely had moments where I thought they were a little faulty, but this season I haven't seen any of those. So Texas isn't going to move for me. Looking forward to that Oklahoma game for sure. I think that's going to show a lot of things, but they're really, really good right now.
Yeah. And next up in my 3-2 spot, like we said, they stayed the same. Michigan and Ohio State. I'm going to do a little 2-for-1 here. I still think Ohio State is better than Michigan. They proved it. They went out and beat Notre Dame this week. And honestly, with all these AP rankings, both of us, like we've said throughout the whole season, definitely a hot take wherever you look that we're saying that Ohio State is better than Michigan. And we've been standing on it too. And this week proved it. I mean, this Ohio State team, I still think is the second best in the country up to this point. They're better than Michigan. They have better wins than Michigan, especially after last week, going into Notre Dame and getting that win. And no matter how many points you win by, that's still a win. They got it done on the last play of the game. And they're still, I mean, I honestly could see after that win, you could make an argument with Georgia not looking as great. They've got some first overall placements, but I don't see how this Ohio State team isn't better than Michigan up to this point. The AP just moved them up to 4 at this point, and they still have Michigan as the second best in the country. I just don't really see it overall. I think this Ohio State team is one of the best in the country. And up to this point, I mean, that win is huge for them. I haven't seen a huge win from Michigan yet, so I'm waiting on that. Obviously, these two teams will take off at the end of the year. But if we're looking at a team like Michigan, who is going to play Penn State later in the year, they're playing at Penn State. Obviously, that's a little further down the line, and I'll probably have a prediction by then. But as of right now, don't be surprised if Penn State goes in there and beats Michigan. The other way, though, I see Ohio State, Penn State playing in Ohio State. I see Ohio State winning that game. So as of right now, Michigan's still ranked at number 3, but there's still a lot of question marks around that team, especially with the offensive play. And I just haven't seen them get a big win like we've seen with Ohio State so far.
Yeah, I think a lot of the issues that I have with people that make lists, whether it's AP, the coaches poll, just dudes on YouTube like us, is that they take their preseason rankings a little too seriously. I know we care about our preseason rankings because we want to look good, but at the end of the day, we have to be honest. And Ohio State beating Notre Dame is a better win than Michigan has even sniffed this year. I understand Michigan is also really good. I don't want to get lost in this narrative and make it sound like I don't think Michigan's good. They're a playoff team for sure. But I mean, they're beating up on Rutgers and Blake Corum, 2 touchdowns, but he's not even getting 100 yards. McCarthy looks okay. They're not doing anything that's particularly wowing me. They're handling business. And as I've said multiple times in pretty much every video, if you handle business, I'm not going to mess with you too much, but they're not doing anything to actively impress me. I think going into the Ohio State Notre Dame game, I think Ohio State was the better team, but Notre Dame had a lot of momentum. A lot of people, wherever you looked, were saying Notre Dame goes in and wins that game, and Ohio State just didn't let it happen. Whether it was close or not, I don't really care. Would I rather see Michigan beat up on Rutgers or Ohio State win a close one against Notre Dame? It's 2 different types of football at that point. Ohio State is really solid. Kyle McCord, I think in college football, it's normal to have question marks at QB, but he was a question mark that I really wasn't too sure of at all. He's looked incredible. His biggest thing is I was scared he's going to throw too many interceptions, fumble the ball too much. Hasn't been any of that at all. Fits in the offense really well, doesn't turn the ball over. And obviously Henderson, great on the ground. Harrison, good in the air. I mean, they have all the right players on paper. So, we're both going to agree here that Michigan is not the better team. But honestly, I want to see, guys that make lists that have Michigan higher explain why besides the fact that they were higher in their preseason rankings. Because if we're talking about what we've actually seen production wise from these teams, it's not particularly close. I think it's Georgia, Ohio State top two, then everyone else. So it's rambling, it's an argument, but at the end of the day, I don't see the other side as much as I do for some of the other teams we talk about down the board.
Yeah, and a perfect segue into number one. Georgia, a lot of teams are saying that they shouldn't be at number one now because of the preseason rankings. And it's interesting to pull that up, especially if you're going to have Michigan still be that high, but you're going to move Georgia down. This Georgia team has struggled a little bit, but they are having a quarterback who's going in there in his first season. The defense, though, has been the best in the country, and we've seen that. I mean, this team hasn't lost in almost 3 years, and there's a reason why they're still this high. You bring in whatever baggage you have from the last 2 seasons, back-to-back national championships, but this team from top to bottom is still one of the best in the country. I mean, you can pull up the preseason rankings too. I know some people are moving Georgia down because of this, but you can't have Michigan, who doesn't have one of those big-time wins, above them. Honestly, if you went into this week and told me that Ohio State deserved to be above Georgia, I would agree with that, and I could see where you have that. But I still think Georgia is the best team in college football right now. And going into this week, they should beat Auburn, but on the road in Auburn, the spread's only 14.5. This could be one of those trap games like we've seen before. So an interesting game, and this is definitely a big game for them, because if it's close, a lot of people are going to come for them, especially with Ohio State getting that big win, especially with all the Michigan lovers. And if they go out there and they win this next game, then they're probably going to move them up again too. They're going to go against Nebraska, and if they win by 40 and Georgia even struggles by 7 points, they're going to put them up there. But this Georgia team's still the best in the country, and this Auburn game is going to be a sneaky test, especially in Auburn.
Yeah, and the difference between a team like Michigan, who I just argued shouldn't be up there because of the preseason rankings, and Georgia is that Georgia actually deserves the spot. There's a reason they were number one in everyone's preseason rankings. It's because they have the best defense in college football. They have a top 10 offense in college football. They have the best coaching in college football. They have all the things. I mean, yeah, you're not impressed with their schedule, but that's because they haven't played anyone. You could call it soft or whatever, but you can't be mad that they're beating up on the teams that they have to. Michigan is just giving, in my opinion, they're giving way too much of, credit for not a whole lot. Georgia gets this credit because on paper, they're the best team in college football, and they haven't lost a game in 3 years. It's just different levels to this. What I will say is Georgia's not like Michigan to me. Georgia's like a way better version of USC. People don't like USC and they want to bump them down because they haven't won anything, but they've looked really good against all the teams that they're supposed to look really good against. And I feel the exact same way about Georgia, as you mentioned, which is a take I completely agree with. If you want to argue Ohio State, go nuts. So, I'm sorry to Wolverines fans that the last three picks, our last three spots, we've really just been talking about how we don't like Michigan, but at the end of the day, I think we're in a different playing field here. I hate that Ohio State is ranked outside of the top three even anywhere, because Ohio State and Georgia deserve to be in these two spots. I think Georgia, obviously Auburn, SEC play, trap game, you call it what you want. Georgia's going to win that game. We both know it. And unless they look really, really bad on one side of the ball, then I have no problems with that being a 2-score game. Georgia's really good. In this last game against UAB, Beck threw 338 yards, 3 touchdowns. Not something to take lightly, in my opinion. Doesn't matter who it's against. Bulldogs are really good. This top 4 is controversial to some, but we're sticking with our guns here. I think, especially in the top 2, these are the best teams in the country.
Yeah, and Georgia, one of those teams that they've got through the beginning of the schedule pretty easily, but I mean, 4 of their last 5 games, Florida, Missouri, Ole Miss, and Tennessee in a row. Those, no matter where they're ranked at the end of the season, we have them all ranked now. They're going to be very tough games for them. So Georgia, we'll see what happens by the end of this schedule. And maybe by then, people will have them give them back their number 1 spot if they took them away. But like we said, talking a little bad about Michigan up to this point. But once they prove us wrong, then they'll prove us wrong. But for now, we both have Ohio State above them. And that doesn't mean Michigan's bad. We still have them ranked as the 3rd team in the country. It's basically like the age-old argument between LeBron and Jordan. Everyone gets upset, especially if you're on one side. That means that if you think the other team, if you say one bad thing about them, then they're not as good. Michigan's still a top 3 team in the country, and we have them there for a reason. So for now, Ohio State is still the better team. But if we see something different, we might have to wait until the end of the season until that matchup. But for now, we have Ohio State up there. And going into this week, we are going to see some big matchups, like we said before, potential teams jumping up too. That Duke and Notre Dame game, if Duke can get that win, which would be massive, they are knocking on the door of at least a top 15 spot, even higher. So very interesting game to watch out for there. And by the time we come back next week, we will have some very different rankings. So we'll see you then.
Appreciate you guys.